The air in the sleepy town of Havenwood always held a certain tranquility, a peaceful hum that lulled its residents into a false sense of security. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and children played unsupervised until dusk. But that tranquility was a fragile veneer, a beautiful lie that shattered on a crisp autumn morning. It started with a simple, almost poetic image. A young boy, no older than 12, was skipping stones across the surface of the Willow Creek, a narrow tributary that wound its way through the edge of town. He wasn't looking for anything, just enjoying the simple pleasure of a perfect skip. But as the sun caught the water just so, he saw something glinting on the muddy bank. It wasn't a rock or a piece of glass, but a small silver chain. Curiosity, as it so often does, got the better of him. He knelt down, his sneakers sinking slightly into the soft earth, and picked it up. What he held in his palm was a necklace, but not just any necklace. It was a delicate silver chain from which hung a small, heart-shaped locket. It was tarnished and caked with mud, but as he rubbed it with the sleeve of his flannel shirt, the intricate engraving on the front became visible. A single, elegant letter L. Inside, when he managed to pry it open, were two faded photographs. One was of a smiling young girl with bright blue eyes and hair the color of corn silk. The other was of a smiling woman who looked strikingly similar, but older, with the kindest eyes you've ever seen. The boy, innocent and unknowing, felt a pang of sadness. The photos seemed so full of life, yet the necklace felt so abandoned, so lost. He took it home, showing it to his mother, a kind woman named Eleanor who worked as a librarian at the town's small public library. Eleanor's heart sank as she looked at the locket. There was something about it that felt deeply wrong, something that whispered of a story far darker than the innocent discovery her son had made. The smiling faces in the locket seemed to plead for help, for recognition. She had a memory, a fleeting image from a news report she had seen months ago, of a missing child. A girl named Lily, with bright blue eyes and hair the color of corn silk. Eleanor, with a growing sense of dread, knew she had to act. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a lost piece of jewelry, but a breadcrumb, a forgotten clue in a tragedy that had haunted the community for months. She called the local sheriff, a stoic and weary man named Sheriff Miller, who had seen enough of the world's darkness to know that a seemingly innocent find could be a Pandora's box. Sheriff Miller arrived at Eleanor's home, his face a mask of practiced calm, but his eyes held a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. The case of Lily Monroe had been a cold one, a relentless ghost that had tormented the town and his own conscience. A 9-year-old girl, vanishing from her backyard without a trace. No witnesses, no ransom note, just a void where a vibrant young life used to be. The media attention had been a hurricane, and then, as is often the case, it had faded, leaving behind a silence far more deafening than the noise. He took the necklace from Eleanor's trembling hand. The mud-caked silver, the heart-shaped locket, the faded photographs. It all matched the detailed description of a necklace Lily had received from her mother for her birthday, a gift she was never without. The intricate L engraving, a unique detail that hadn't been widely publicized, was a chilling confirmation. The moment he saw it, Sheriff Miller felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The tranquility of Havenwood was a lie. Something terrible had happened in this quiet town, and the Willow Creek, a source of life and peace, had been holding its secret all along. The question wasn't just where Lily was, but what had happened to her, and why her precious necklace had been found here, miles from her home, in the quiet, unassuming waters of the creek. This wasn't a breakthrough. It was a devastating and terrifying new beginning. The discovery of Lily's necklace in the Willow Creek didn't just reopen the case. It ripped it wide open, exposing old wounds and revealing new, terrifying possibilities. Sheriff Miller, with the necklace now secured as evidence, felt a sense of urgency he hadn't experienced since the day Lily vanished. The serene creek, once a symbol of the town's peaceful nature, now felt like a sinister accomplice, a silent witness to a crime yet to be understood. He ordered a full-scale search of the creek and its banks, a meticulous and grueling process that involved dozens of volunteers and law enforcement officers. They scoured every inch of the water, every tangled root, every mudflat. But the creek, it seemed, had given up its only secret. No other evidence was found, leaving them with more questions than answers. How did the necklace end up in the creek? Was it thrown there, or did it fall off? And most importantly, where was Lily? The search team's efforts, while fruitless in finding new evidence, did bring up a new thread of inquiry. A young deputy, fresh out of the academy, noticed something peculiar about the creek's flow. It wasn't a natural current. It was a slow, deliberate movement, funneled by a series of old, forgotten irrigation ditches that crisscrossed the surrounding farmland. These ditches led, in a winding and indirect path, to a large, secluded piece of property on the outskirts of town. This property belonged to a man named Arthur Vance, a reclusive widower in his late 60s who lived alone in a dilapidated farmhouse. Arthur was an enigma in Havenwood. He kept to himself, rarely venturing into town, and when he did, he was polite but distant. He was known for his vast collection of antique furniture and his meticulous, almost obsessive attention to his sprawling, unkempt garden. He was a man of routines, and his neighbors, who were few and far between, rarely saw him break them. Sheriff Miller, a man who trusted his gut feelings more than anything else, felt a cold suspicion settle in his bones. The irrigation ditches, the secluded property, the reclusive owner, it all felt too coincidental. He knew he had to pay Arthur a visit, a polite but firm conversation to see if he knew anything about the necklace, or perhaps, if he had seen anything unusual in the months since Lily's disappearance. The visit was tense. Arthur Vance, a man with a shock of white hair and a gaunt face, met Sheriff Miller at his front door with an air of weary indifference. He denied any knowledge of the necklace or the missing girl, claiming he spent his days in his garden and rarely paid attention to the news. His eyes, a pale blue that seemed to have seen too much, were unblinking, betraying no emotion. But there was something in his posture, a subtle stiffness, that suggested a man holding a secret close to his chest. Sheriff Miller left the farmhouse feeling more unsettled than when he had arrived. Arthur's story was plausible, but it didn't feel right. He couldn't shake the image of the irrigation ditches leading directly to Arthur's property. The creek's current, however slow, would have carried the necklace in a specific direction, and that direction pointed to Arthur's land. Back at his office, Sheriff Miller went over the details of Lily's case again. Her parents, devastated and broken, had been cooperative but had provided little information that could lead to a breakthrough. They were a simple, loving family, and the disappearance of their daughter had shattered their world. The media, in their frenzy, had painted them as tragic figures, but Sheriff Miller saw them as something more. Two people living in a waking nightmare, praying for a miracle. He remembered a small detail from one of his earlier interviews with Lily's mother, a quiet woman named Sarah. She had mentioned that Lily had a favorite place to play, a small, overgrown clearing in the woods behind her house, not far from the creek. The clearing was a sanctuary for Lily, a place where she would build forts and play with her imaginary friends. It was in this clearing that Lily's parents last saw her, just before she vanished. Sheriff Miller felt a jolt of realization. The clearing was located upstream from where the necklace was found. The current, however slow, would have carried the necklace downstream, away from the clearing and towards Arthur Vance's property. The puzzle pieces, once scattered and seemingly unrelated, were beginning to fit together in a chilling and terrifying picture. The tranquility of Havenwood wasn't just a lie. It was a carefully constructed facade, and the man who had been living behind it all along was now standing at the center of a very dark and twisted secret. The trail of the necklace, leading from the overgrown clearing where Lily was last seen, downstream to Arthur Vance's secluded property, was a chilling roadmap of a potential crime. Sheriff Miller, now convinced that Arthur was a key figure in Lily's disappearance, knew he had to proceed with caution. He couldn't act on a gut feeling alone. He needed concrete evidence. He spent the next few days building a case against Arthur Vance, meticulously sifting through old records and interviewing his few neighbors. The picture that emerged was of a man who was deeply isolated, a man who had lost his wife years ago and had never truly recovered. His wife, a vibrant woman named Evelyn, had been the heart and soul of their marriage, a counterbalance to Arthur's quiet, solitary nature. Her death, from a sudden and aggressive illness, had left a void that Arthur had never managed to fill. One of Arthur's neighbors, an elderly woman named Martha who had lived next door for decades, provided a crucial and deeply disturbing piece of information. She recalled a time, several months before Lily's disappearance, when she had seen Arthur in his garden, talking to himself. She had initially dismissed it as a harmless eccentricity, but as she listened, she realized he wasn't just talking to himself. He was talking to his deceased wife. He was reminiscing about their life together, about the family they had always wanted but never had. He spoke of a daughter, a little girl with bright blue eyes and hair the color of corn silk, the very image of Lily. Martha, a kind and compassionate woman, had felt a pang of pity for Arthur's grief. But now, in the light of Lily's disappearance and the discovery of her necklace, the memory took on a sinister new meaning. Was Arthur's grief so profound that it had twisted his mind, leading him to believe that a missing child was the daughter he had always wanted? Sheriff Miller, his heart heavy with the weight of this new information, knew he had to secure a search warrant for Arthur Vance's property. The justification was thin, but the circumstantial evidence was mounting. The necklace, the irrigation ditches, Arthur's reclusive nature, and now Martha's disturbing recollection. It was a pattern of behavior that was too alarming to ignore. The search of Arthur's property was a tense and somber affair. Law enforcement officers, with the help of a K-9 unit trained in cadaver search, combed the grounds, the dilapidated farmhouse, and the sprawling garden. The K-9 unit, a beautiful golden retriever named Rusty, was the first to give them a breakthrough. He led them to a small, hidden shed at the back of the property, a structure that was so overgrown with ivy and wild roses that it was almost invisible. Inside the shed, they found nothing. It was empty, save for a few old gardening tools and a pile of sawdust. But Rusty, the K-9, began to whine, his nose pressed to a small, loose floorboard in the corner. Sheriff Miller, his heart pounding in his chest, knelt down and pried the board loose. Beneath it, in a small, cramped space, was a child's backpack. It was Lily's backpack. It was a bright pink backpack with a cartoon unicorn on the front, a backpack that had been plastered on missing posters all over town. Inside, they found her school books, a half-eaten granola bar, and a small, worn-out teddy bear. But what they didn't find, what was conspicuously absent, was any sign of Lily herself. The discovery was a devastating blow. It confirmed their worst fears, that Lily had been on Arthur's property, and that he was involved in her disappearance. But it didn't tell them where she was. The search of the property continued, but the sun was setting, and the hope they had felt with the discovery of the backpack was beginning to wane. Sheriff Miller, standing in the fading light, felt a wave of despair wash over him. The case was a puzzle with a missing piece, a story with a devastating and tragic climax that was yet to be revealed. He knew he had to confront Arthur Vance, not just with a polite inquiry, but with the full weight of the evidence they had found. He had to face this broken man, this reclusive widower, and ask him the question that had been haunting the town for months. What had he done with Lily? The truth was no longer a matter of speculation. It was a dark, festering wound that had finally been uncovered, and now it was time to face the man who had inflicted it. The peaceful town of Havenwood was about to learn just how fragile its tranquility truly was. The discovery of Lily's backpack on Arthur Vance's property was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. It was the irrefutable evidence that connected the reclusive widower to the disappearance of the young girl. Sheriff Miller, with a search warrant in hand and the weight of a town's hopes and fears on his shoulders, returned to the dilapidated farmhouse. This time, there was no polite conversation. Arthur Vance, a man who had seemed so composed and indifferent just days before, was now a portrait of a man coming apart at the seams. His eyes, once pale and unblinking, now darted around the room, full of a frantic, animal fear. He denied everything, his voice a hoarse whisper, but his body language told a different story. He trembled, his hands shaking as he poured himself a glass of water, spilling more on the table than in the glass. Sheriff Miller, his voice low and steady, laid out the evidence. The necklace, the irrigation ditches, the backpack, and Martha's testimony. He spoke of the grief, the loneliness, the twisted logic that could lead a man to believe a missing child was a gift from a lost love. He didn't accuse. He simply stated the facts, letting the devastating weight of the truth settle in the room. And then Arthur broke. The dam of his composure gave way, and he began to weep, a sound so raw and heartbreaking that it was almost unbearable. He confessed, his words tumbling out in a torrent of guilt and despair. He spoke of seeing Lily playing in the clearing, of her resemblance to his beloved Evelyn, of a moment of madness where he convinced himself that she was a gift, a second chance. He had lured her to his property with a promise of showing her a rare bird, a lie she had believed with the innocent trust of a child. He led Sheriff Miller and his deputies to a secluded spot in his garden, a place hidden beneath a canopy of old, weeping willows. There, beneath a newly tilled flower bed, they found her. Lily's body, wrapped in a blanket, was a heartbreaking image of a life extinguished far too soon. Her bright blue eyes, once so full of life, were now closed in a final, eternal sleep. Her corn silk hair was matted with dirt, and in her small hand, she was still clutching the worn-out teddy bear from her backpack. The town of Havenwood, once a symbol of peace and tranquility, was now a town in mourning. The funeral for Lily Monroe was a somber affair, a sea of black clothes and tear-stained faces. Her parents, a broken shell of the people they once were, stood by her graveside, their grief a palpable, tangible thing. The necklace, the beautiful silver chain with the L engraving, was placed in her coffin, a final token of a life that had been so cruelly and senselessly taken. Arthur Vance was arrested and charged with kidnapping and murder. He offered no defense, no excuse, just a silent, hollow acceptance of his fate. His grief had not only consumed him, it had twisted him into a monster, a man who had stolen a child's life to fill the void left by his own. The Willow Creek, once a peaceful waterway, now held a dark and terrible memory. The necklace, a small, glinting object in the muddy bank, had been the key, a breadcrumb left behind by a child's final moments, a silent scream that had finally been heard. It was a reminder that even in the most peaceful of places, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The story of Lily Monroe, and the necklace that led to her, is a story of loss, of a town's shattered innocence, and of the devastating consequences of unchecked grief. But it is also a story of hope, a reminder that even when a life is taken, its memory, its story, can live on, and a reminder that justice, however long it takes, can and will be served. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of justice and the unmasking of darkness, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. There are so many stories waiting to be told, and we want to share them all with you.